invalid, okay? And when an argument is invalid, what can we say about the conclusion? A lot of people are tempted to say, well, so we now know that the conclusion is false. No, all that we can say when we determine that an argument is invalid is that the conclusion is unsupported, that the argument was not good. It did not establish the conclusion. And that's different from saying the conclusion is false. Does everybody understand that? Okay? Okay. If an argument is deductive and valid, then we're going to continue looking at it, and now we're going to ask, first we assume the premises are true, and now we're going to ask, are the premises actually true? Okay? And if the answer is yes, all the premises are true, we say that the argument is sound. Okay? And if one or more of the premises are not true, we say the argument is unsound. And if the argument is unsound, the conclusion is unsupported. Never are we saying the conclusion is false. In order to say that something's false, we have to have an argument that says, and therefore this is false. Everybody understand that? All we're doing by pointing out that something is invalid or unsound is that the argument doesn't prove what it's supposed to prove. Okay. So, what's the very best kind of argument you could have? One that's deductive and valid and sound. And what follows, if all those things are true, the conclusion must be true. Everybody got that? So the very best kind of argument you can make is one that's deductive, valid, and what? Sound. Now notice that I'm using the term valid in a very particular way. Valid only applies to deductive arguments. Does everybody understand that? Inductive arguments are not valid or invalid, and conclusions are not valid or invalid. Premises are not valid or invalid. Only arguments, deductive arguments, are valid or invalid. Okay. The way that I'm using this term in here does not match up with how people use the word valid in ordinary English. In ordinary English, people use the term valid to mean something like is true, right? So I might say, you have a valid point there, and I'm not saying you have a deductive argument in which the conclusion follows from the premises. What I'm saying is, I think what you said is true. Does everybody understand that? So realize we are using this word in a very particular fashion, the way that logicians and mathematicians use it, okay? And it's gonna conflict with the way ordinary people might use the term. So it drives me nuts when I hear people flinging around the term valid as they do, because I'm thinking this, and they're not. Okay, so now we'll do a kind of a parallel process with inductive arguments. Suppose that we've determined that the argument is inductive. We're going to ask a question similar to that, but not exactly the same. Because remember, the difference between deductive and inductive arguments is deductive arguments use the kind of evidence that can, in theory, prove the conclusion to be true, whereas inductive arguments can only show that the conclusion is what? Likely to be true. Does everybody understand that? Okay. So we're going to ask this question. Is the conclusion likely to be true, assuming the premises are true? Okay? So right off the bat, we don't ask, are the premises true or false? Assume that they are true and ask, is the conclusion likely to be true? Does everybody understand that? Now, there's a couple things to say about this. First of all, and if the answer is yes, I forgot. If we say yes, it's likely to be true, we say the argument is strong, okay? If we say, well, those premises really don't have anything to do with the conclusion, then we say it's weak. Does everybody understand that? And if it's a weak argument, they have not supported the conclusion. That's what we would say, okay? Okay. Now, the fact of the matter is that inductive arguments aren't just solidly strong or solidly weak. Does everybody understand that? You can have a gray area. And so you might say, well, I don't know if it's strong or if it's weak. That's fine. That just means you understand the evidence isn't super strong, but then again, it's not too weak. Does everybody understand that? For testing purposes, I'm going to try to pick arguments that are clearly strong or clearly weak. Does everybody understand that? The fact that you realize that some arguments are kind of in between just means that you understand that the evidence is only so good. Does everybody understand? And one of the things that makes it even more confusing is this. Depending on what hangs on being right about whether or not the conclusion is true, you might require stronger evidence for it to be considered strong. Okay, let me explain this by way of an example. Suppose that my son and I want to watch some MMA fight that's supposed to come on and the power is going off, as it does all the time. And so we turn everything off because we don't want anything to bust up from a surge when it comes back on. And suppose I'm looking at my watch, it's getting close to fight time, so I ask my son, is the power back on? And he determines whether or not the power is back on by flipping a light switch. He flips it, nothing happens, so he flips it back and he says, the power is not on. Well, in that case, we might say, yeah, that was a good way to test whether or not the power is on or off. Does everybody understand that? And so we might say, well, he knows that the power is not on, and so that would be a strong argument that the power is not on. But suppose that the reason why I asked my son, is the power on, is because I'm under the house making repairs to the wiring. And he flips the switch and the light does not come on. And so he flips it back and he says, the power is not on. Is that method for determining whether or not the power is on sufficient? Is it good enough to know that the power is not on, given the circumstances that my life depends on him being right? No, because the light bulb could be burnt out. So the power could be on, thinking that, and he's thinking it's off, and so I end up fried. Does everybody understand that? What should he do to check whether or not the power is on in a case like that?
Go to the electrical box.
And flip that breaker, that big breaker. Does everybody understand that? Right? When the people come to repair your air conditioner or whatnot, that's the first thing that they do. They flip that breaker. Or a lot of air conditioners now have their own breaker, right? So they can just pull it out and just isolate that. So determining whether it's strong or weak is not an exact science. Does everybody understand that? But for the test, I'll try to make it clearly strong or clearly weak. Okay. And if it's weak, we say, go away, get a better argument, you didn't support the conclusion. But let's suppose that we have a strong argument, and now we ask, are the premises true? Okay, if the answer is yes, we say the argument is cogent. And if the answer is no, we say the argument is not cogent. Okay? And if an argument is not cogent, well, the conclusion has not been supported. It's not to say that it's false, it's just not proven. Everybody understand that? Okay? So the best kind of inductive argument you could have is one that's strong and cogent. Everybody got that? Okay. Now, one word of warning. People will invariably do this when they're dealing with inductive arguments. When they're asking the question, is it strong or weak, they ask this. Given this evidence, is it necessarily the case that so-and-so? And they say no. It's that not necessarily, therefore weak. That's not what you're supposed to do. Because remember, inductive arguments, by the nature of them being inductive arguments, can never prove the conclusion. So the evidence doesn't guarantee the conclusion. So it's not necessarily true in any case for any inductive argument. Does everybody understand that? So what you really need to ask yourself is, what's the probability? That's what you're thinking about. If the probability of the conclusion being true given the evidence is high, then you say strong. And if it's low, you say weak, right? You don't just say, well, yes, that could be true, but the conclusion could be false. That doesn't matter. You ask, what's the probability? Everybody understand that? And let's say if it's 80% or above, you might say, yeah, it's strong, right? If it's 50-50, well, that's a pretty middle of the road, inconclusive argument. If the probability of the conclusion is true is only 20% given the evidence, that's clearly weak. Does everybody understand that? Okay. So notice the terms valid, invalid, sound, and unsound only apply to deductive arguments, and inductive arguments, strong, weak, cogent, and not cogent, are the terms that apply to inductive arguments and inductive arguments only. Has everybody got that? Okay. So what will you be doing for tests? One, you'll be determining whether it's inductive or deductive. And you've got to be on the lookout for this, right? Okay. Then I'm also going to ask you, supposing it's deductive, tell me which kind. And then I'm going to ask you, is it valid or invalid? Okay, so you have to tell me, you have to determine if it's inductive or deductive. If it's deductive, what kind? And then I'm going to ask you if it's valid or invalid. And what you're doing is you're assuming the premises are true and asking, if I assume the premises are true, would the conclusion be true? If the answer is yes, you say valid. If the answer is no, you say invalid. Okay. The one thing I'm not going to ask you is whether or not the argument is sound or unsound. Why? Because